Welcome to the Closer Look for the 13th of December, 2023, as part of the Knightsbridge Research Global Hotspot Briefing that we present to our subscribers each week in this space. This is a bit of a longer, closer look as we finish up this series. Typically, we do closer looks around 30 minutes apiece. This one's going to go a little bit longer. So as you probably noticed, we cut short the first half of the briefing so that we could deliver this conclusion to you, our subscriber. This is the agenda that we've been working through, as you've seen each of the last 2 weeks, and we're looking forward to wrapping this up with our conclusions, especially, and looking forward to 2024 and what our projections are there. As you know, our Closer Look series is being brought to you by guest contributor Joshua Stevens. He also presented the Emerging Military Tactics in Ukraine 3-part series in summer 2023. You can see his credentials there, and I won't spend too much time on that because this is the third consecutive week of showing you this slide. But he spent a lot of time overseas fighting for the United States and is now a small business owner at tfirearms.com. As always, we greatly appreciate his insights and his contributions here at Knightsbridge.
So most of this stuff is stuff that we've kind of talked about in the individual slides, but we're just going to kind of summarize it real quick and kind of look at what made this, in my opinion, an unsuccessful offensive, and then what we should be looking for, especially with the Russian offensive coming up, to see whether they've learned from this or whether they're going to repeat the same mistakes as they go into their offenses. So one of the big issues, and we were just talking about it in the last slide, is Ukraine went into this with extremely unrealistic goals. And I don't know how much of that was propaganda and how much of that was actually what they believed. And there's always, throughout warfare, there's always been a significant disconnect between the policymakers and the politicians up at the top that are making decisions and what's actually happening down at the ground. And it was something, I mean, we experienced in the United States military in Afghanistan and Iraq, myself personally at least, but it's happened throughout warfare. I mean, you can read reports of, like Julius Caesar talking about if they only knew what was happening down here in Gaul, they would give me what I asked for. It's a common issue. And as leaders or politicians, military leaders, you get these classes all the time about go out and go see what's happening. Go look for yourself. Don't trust reports. Get your eyes on the ground. And so good intelligence becomes extraordinarily important. But like we were talking about with the previous slide, you got to understand the biases that are filtering your intelligence. Because if you're making massive decisions on where to commit forces, how to commit forces, what to do with forces based on bad information, then not only are you wasting your time, you're damaging your reputation as a leader and as a military, but you're also throwing away lives. And I feel very strongly that in a lot of cases is what happened here. So unrealistic goals were one of many cards that caused us to have issues, but it was one of the more important ones.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Oh, yep.
Before we jump to the next section, I mean, I agree completely with that this is one of the things that going all the way back to the spring, right? We covered this extensively in our daily reports that Zelensky was constantly trumpeting that the war will not conclude until Crimea's return to Ukraine, right? Stuff like that,
Yes.
right? And
I know you and I personally had a couple of good laughs about that.
oh yeah, and we're looking at the facts of the matter from an unbiased, like rational perspective, saying if that's the goal, the war will go 100 years, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because, and maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole, but overall, like you're not going to retake Crimea. I mean, our assessment going back to basically the beginning of this conflict was that Russia would use nuclear weapons to defend Crimea. We didn't
Yeah.
think they would use nuclear weapons in really any other scenario, but Russia's not losing Crimea. They are not. They will not. And so when Zelensky comes out and says, the war won't conclude until every Russian's pushed out of Crimea, and basically insinuating that that was going to happen at this counteroffensive, I mean, there's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of, I think, warranted doubt about his statement. So I agree with you completely that the goals that were set up by Ukraine were completely unwarranted. They were completely
Yeah.
unrealistic. And I think that the repercussions of that, looking to the future, is that Ukraine's Western allies are looking at the failure of this counteroffensive and saying, hey,
Yeah.
you were going to push Russia out of Donetsk, Luhansk, and maybe even Crimea, and you didn't even come close. So why are we
Yeah.
wasting, our military assets and our resources and our funds for you?
And that's one of
Right?
the
That there's
that's one of the
long
really
running repercussions here from that.
absolutely. No, and that's one of the really big issues with unrealistic goals, especially as a leader. And I mean, you see it, we talk about it in business all the time, but from a military perspective, which is where I learned most of this, that I apply to the business world now, is if you can't set realistic goals, you undermine your credibility as a leader, but it has a huge detrimental effect to morale because you've got these soldiers and
Yes.
I've personally had it happen to me where military leaders have said, "Hey, we're going to do this," and you're hearing the words come out of your mouth, and you're like, there's no way that's going to occur. That's completely improbable, impossible. You cannot provide that to me. So then you've undermined yourself, or you've undermined yourself as a leader in the minds of your soldiers, who are supposed to be depending on you, depending on your soundness of mind, your leadership, and so you erode that trust, and you create these situations where it's very easy for guys to be like, "Hey, I'm not attacking that dude. It's you've gone crazy. You're not the one out here getting shot, and I'm not doing that. We're not going in." But also on the bigger, in this case, political view world, um, now they've got the Western supporters going, you really pulled the wool over our eyes with that one. We gave you how many millions, and you couldn't even make it, an eighth of a way to your. So it's I think the long term repercussions of that will probably be fairly extensive.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that completely. We're already seeing the trend of lesser support to Ukraine, right? We've
Absolutely.
covered that
Yeah.
in multiple reports recently and multiple briefings as well.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of that does go back to the goals that Ukraine, Zelensky in
Yeah.
particular, set for this counteroffensive that just flat out did not happen.
Yeah.
And so there's something of a direct correlation there. That's
I
not the
would
only
I would definitely
factor,
agree.
but I mean, there's
But
there's
it
there's
is it's a
probably,
significant one for sure.
yeah, there's dozens of factors, right? But this is a big one.
Absolutely.
This is a big one.
Yeah. And then that segues very nicely into inadequate use of surprise, which we discussed that pretty thoroughly early on. But the whole early announcement, the fact that Russia had literally months to prepare for this, definitely hurt the offensive operation before it could even start. And then their propaganda video of, hey, be quiet, uh, don't talk about, well, there's one thing that we could not be talking about, so that must be occurring. And I feel like those were all mistakes, um, from a military doctrine perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then poor logistics and buildup. Because there was so much confusion about when the starts were going to occur, how they were going to occur, what was going to happen. Was it a feint? Was it not a feint? And I feel like, and again, it's the fog of war, but these breakdown in communications between higher echelon forces. They're saying we're going in tomorrow, maybe, and guys on the ground they're going like, we don't know when we're going in. Created these logistical issues where you had guys that were actively on defensive operations, so they're focused on defense against the Russians, and then being told, hey, surprise, check your Twitter feed, we're not talking about the offensive we're launching. And you saw it when it first kicked off. There was a lot of inconsistency across the lines, and maybe it was intentional, maybe they were doing probing attacks, but there seemed to be indicators that there was just confusion about what was going on. And so it caused there to be a lack of logistical preparation in the buildup. But also, you had these problems where these forces that were supposed to be, getting ready to invade were partially divided between supporting Bakhmut and reconstituting after Bakhmut or things like that. So there were a lot of initial issues due to confusion about what was going on. And to me, that was kind of an indicator. And again, this is me speculating, but it was an indicator to me that there was even confusion on from Ukrainian leadership over what was actually occurring and how it was going to occur.
Yeah, there's
And
not a
then,
lot of coherence among
yes,
Ukrainian leadership, right? And you see near
yeah,
constant turnover at the highest
yes,
level of Ukrainian leadership.
yes,
And I think that points to the fact that they're not on the same page, that there's not a lot
yeah,
of coherence, and that Zelensky frequently has to let go, fire, whatever your term is,
yeah,
remove a lot of folks at the highest levels.
yes. Which is kind of interesting because it was, I'm going to wax historical here real quick, but that was one of the big issues with the USSR when they were defending against the Nazis in World War II. Is they had the same issue. They had Stalin literally didn't trust anybody. If you had a type A personality, you were probably going to assassinate him. At least in his mind, that's how he saw it. And so he was constantly axing all of these leaders and getting rid of these leaders. And you had guys on the ground that were just trying to stem the Nazi onslaught, saying, I don't even know who's in charge today. I knew it was this guy yesterday, and then it was that guy right after him, but they've both been fired and executed out back. And I don't know who's in charge of me. And so anytime you have that high turnover and you have these leaders that are looking to do whatever it takes to secure their jobs and not be the next guy that gets fired, you have you just have confusion and you have a lack of coherency and a lack of big picture that's pushing people forward. And we definitely saw that. And that segues over into the next point, which is unadaptable plans. And so I suspect because of the lack of coherence, once they had these plans established, they were looking at those as hard lines. No matter what, we can't change this plan. And so when they're hitting these minefields and they're losing entire brigades in, hails of shrapnel and artillery, they're still pushing forward. They're still trying to make it to Tokmak and things like that, where they should have pulled back. They should have reconsolidated. They should have taken a second look at the situation and either reinforced the lines or reconsolidated and figured out different tactics, which you saw some. There was some adaptability. They got better at using mine clearing teams. They got better at hitting these defensive lines, but it was too little too late by the time it happened. And it didn't happen until there was a significant physical toll in personnel, which unfortunately for Ukraine, that is something that they do not have the luxury of possessing, especially in comparison to Russia. Their personnel are their most valuable asset. They can get equipment, and there's multiple reports that have come out. I know Nightbridge has mentioned it a couple of times, where Russia's lamenting the fact that we've got more people than we have guns, and Ukraine's saying we've got all this equipment and nobody to use it. And unfortunately, for Ukraine, people are somewhat irreplaceable. They can't, they're not going to be able to get these Foreign Legion volunteers like they had originally. And I mean, they didn't even have a huge number of those realistically. It was more propaganda than anything else. Especially now, especially, if you're really interested in this war and you dig around on, Telegram or things like that, and you start watching the footage, like, I'm a pretty seasoned combat veteran, and it would take a lot of money to get me over to Ukraine. I definitely wouldn't do it for free. And that's, and I kind of like wars. I think they're fun. So it's for someone like me to say that, your average dude, watching people turned into just meat confetti, it it's not it's not something that they're going to be able to replace those people. Whereas Russia can create more equipment, and they have been. It's another huge indicator that they are gearing up for a winter offensive is how much time and energy they have spent in, one, not expending resources over the summer, and two, in creating more resources. So it's I I feel fairly strongly that this summer offensive might in the long term be the thing that broke Ukraine, or at least broke Ukraine's ability to wage future offensives because of the toll in human lives.
Yeah, and speaking to that point, I mean, for on the Ukrainian side, the one thing that they have guarded more closely than anything else is exactly how many folks are in their military and what their
Yeah.
losses are. right? It's pretty
Yeah.
difficult. Like it's pretty difficult to get information
No,
out of
absolutely.
Ukraine as to how many tanks they have, how many tanks they've lost, APCs, artillery,
Yeah.
jets, all of these things. But nothing is more closely guarded than what the human toll has been
Yeah.
for the UAF. And
There's
that's
been some,
over here at Knightsbridge, right? We're analyzing this type of thing every single day, and we've got some
yeah,
really good folks working on that. But my goodness, this is the most difficult thing to
absolutely.
analyze out of this entire conflict is how many troops does Ukraine have and what is their losses? Because
Yes.
you can't take Ukraine's word for what their losses are, and you can't take Russia's word for what Ukraine's losses are
No.
either,
Yep.
right? Both of those are extraordinarily biased, and they're
Yeah.
absolutely manipulated for their
Yeah.
own purposes. So,
Absolutely.
does Ukraine have the manpower to hold off a Russian offensive in 2024? Do they have the manpower to push forward? Right? These are questions that we
Yeah.
dig into pretty extensively because our private clients and our subscribers are asking them. But it's also the
Yeah.
most difficult thing to ascertain throughout this entire conflict.
Absolutely. And I think that was very interesting about earlier this year when we had the so-called Pentagon leaks
Yes.
regarding US
Yes.
assessments of this information. And again, looking at the numbers that they were trying to ascertain regarding this exact question, it was plus or minus hundreds of thousands. And I think it's really fascinating how closely guarded of a secret that is. And I suspect, and maybe this is just me being cynical, I suspect it is because it is way worse than a lot of people think.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean,
Yeah.
the US is, you know, getting low on artillery shells, and suddenly we're okay with sending cluster bombs, right? We're
Yes.
suddenly okay. And
Which are
you
huge. I mean, that's we've got, I know this could get way into a tangent, but we've got so much money that we donate to foreign aid
yeah,
organizations into Laos and Cambodia, for example, where we
yep,
cluster bombed them like crazy.
yep.
And we were like, hey, we're never going to do this again. That was terrible. We shouldn't have done that. We're sorry that your grandkids are still stepping on these things that are bad. We'll never. And for us to be like, hey, so remember how there was that one thing we said we were never going to do because it was so terrible? It's not that bad actually. It's
Yeah,
you know it's
right.
it's less terrible now. Times have
and
changed.
and
And
it, yeah, and
wait, what?
it's the US, it's the UK, it's France sending much
Yeah,
longer range missiles.
yeah,
It's all of a sudden the Western world is kind of waking up to the fact that
yeah,
Ukraine's cause may be noble. They're defending themselves against a much larger aggressor,
yeah,
etc. But they just don't have the people.
yeah,
Potentially, they potentially don't have the people to actually hold off this aggression by a much larger country that has a lot more human resources, for lack of a better term,
yeah, absolutely.
than they do.
And it's something I've always been fascinated by with warfare is we often I've got we could delve into it sometime. I've got a very cynical view on a lot of warfare, but uh, and especially as Americans, we are conditioned to believe that there is right and wrong, there is the good guy and there's the bad guy, and there's nothing in between. And what we fail to grasp and what we fail to understand, and that's kind of the reality of life, but it's definitely the reality of warfare, is the good guys don't always win. Oftentimes, it's the more ruthless guys that win. It's the guys that are willing to take it the farthest that end up winning.
The
And
ones that are dedicated to winning often
yes,
win.
yes,
Yes.
absolutely. And something that U.S. military leaders often struggle with is the the brutality and the requirements to be successful in warfare are not always conductive to what we consider civilized or humane. And that's not to say, oh, go out and commit war crimes or anything like that. But that is to say that sometimes it's the side that's willing to be more brutal. It's the side that's willing to go the farthest, the fastest, that often wins in conflicts. And I think it's really fascinating to see Western reactions to warfare, specifically just because we live a much more sheltered life than the rest of the world. And these types of things where people are like, yeah, sometimes good people die. Yeah, sometimes bad things happen to good people. And it's kind of brushed off in America. They're like, no, how can this happen? How can the good guys lose? And it's something that's always been, especially since my first deployment, really fascinating to me is how easily the West looks at things through rose-colored glasses.
Yeah, and really the overall um, the overall success in warfare is
Yes.
not dependent upon who is the so-called good guy and so-called bad guy according to your perspective, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's surprise, it's violence of action, it's a lot of other things. It's
Yeah.
dedication to winning. And so far in this conflict, Ukraine has seemed a bit uncertain.
Yes.
They're kind of torn between their Soviet Russian roots, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? If you go back to the early 1900s,
Yes.
they're torn between that method of warfare and what they're being told by their US and NATO advisors. And then
Yes.
also, to put a third leg on that stool, um, the drone warfare
Yeah.
and then kind of the newer tech methods of warfare. And we talked about that when we did a series with you on emerging military tactics in Ukraine, so we don't have to
Yeah.
rehash all of that. But but it
Yes, but no,
seems
those are
like
excellent points.
yeah, but it seems like Ukraine is kind of torn between these three different strategies, and
Yeah.
from where I sit, it doesn't look like they've really decided on which is the best. So they're kind
Yeah.
of tentatively stepping into each of these three pools and, when it comes to warfare on a large scale, typically the best strategy is to pick a strategy and go with it,
Yes.
right?
In warfare,
Dedicate
consistency earns.
yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And I think some of that also too stems from the issues we were talking about with Ukrainian leadership. If you don't have a unified message, like I said, consistency wins wars. You just have to be consistently better than the other guy. You have to be consistent in your plans. And that's normally your winning strategy. And I mean, it's applicable to business as well. But you see these issues with this lack of unity, this lack of cohesion. And a lot of that's, I think, attributable to the issues that we're seeing in Ukrainian leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't object to that.
Which, oh, and we've kind of hammered this point pretty hard, but the cost of manpower. Ukraine doesn't have manpower to lose, and they have lost a lot of it. And again, going back to that map we just looked at, um, it's really hard to justify what they've lost for what they've gained. And then NATO support is the other one. And again, we've kind of beat that horse to death as well. But this loss of credibility to their allies, which, like we were talking about before, that has kind of been the cornerstone of Ukraine's survival up to this point, is their NATO support, their unending supply of equipment, their newer technology, their ability to punch above their weight, which the average Ukrainian fighter is able to do on a phenomenal level. But you can only do so much with so little for so long, especially if those fighters are being exhausted for pointless gains. And that takes us to our final point, which is their gains don't have parity with the costs. And the map we just looked at compared to what what they've lost, or what can be speculated that they've lost, in my mind at least, doesn't add up.
Yeah, that seems to be um, absolutely true. That, when we looked at those maps on the slide that said compare, right, from June to November, there was virtually no gain by Ukrainian
Yeah.
forces. And, per our analysis, Ukraine's lost thousands upon thousands of troops between June and
Yeah.
November. They've lost some, I wouldn't say a lot, but at least some of the Western provided equipment. They've
Yeah.
expended a huge amount of artillery shells and things like that, right? For
Yes.
virtually no gain. And so when
Yeah.
they've made these incremental gains, I mean, Ukraine has made no gains over this counteroffensive that Russia couldn't potentially take back in a week or two, right?
Yes. And that's
And
what's really, really
their costs have
concerning.
been huge. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
concerning. It's massively concerning because when we see a Russian offensive coming up, late winter, early spring, as I think we're all projecting at Knightsbridge,
Yeah.
you could see the entire gain from the counteroffensive wiped out in
Yeah.
a few days.
Yes. Which I think that'll, oh man, you want to talk about a devastating effect on morale. I think that'll be pretty rough. I know
Oh yeah,
I spent the majority of my time in Afghanistan, and there was one, I spent a year fighting in this valley. We had dudes died down there. There was all this stuff went down. And then we pulled out, went down to my second deployment. We were in Kandahar. And while we were in Kandahar, the Taliban was actively taking over the valley that we were in. And we were watching villages that, we knew inch by inch how to pie this house, what corner to hit, get taken back. And for a lot of the guys, it was an extremely demoralizing effect because we were back in Afghanistan again. We were in Kandahar. And they're like, why does any of this matter? As soon as we leave Kandahar, what's going to happen? And, ultimately, Afghanistan is ran by the Taliban right now. And I remember having multiple conversations with, soldiers of mine or peers where they were just devastated by the whole thing. And I'm very curious to see what happens to Ukrainian morale should that be the case with this Russian offensive.
yeah, and that's an interesting point because when we spoke back in August, I think it was off the top of my head, we talked about how Ukrainian morale was much higher than Russian morale, right? They were
Yes.
launching this counteroffensive.
Yeah.
The Russians were seeing, some of their gains all the way up into, some of the northeastern parts of Ukraine have been wiped away by the
Yeah.
previous fall. That would be fall 2022,
Yeah.
is offensive by Ukraine, right? Russian forces had just seen a lot of their gains obliterated, but now we're seeing the other side where
Yeah.
Ukrainian forces made virtually no gains, and Russia may be poised to take what few gains Ukraine made back in an offensive.
Yeah.
And so Russia's kind of already been through this a little bit, where they've already seen their gains obliterated.
Yes.
But Ukraine really hasn't. The initial surge by Russian forces in the south and southeast, and even from the north towards Kiev, we analyzed this when it happened, and we talked about how the stunt towards Kiev was just a stunt. The real effort,
Yes.
right, was in the south and the southeast,
Absolutely.
and I think that held true over time. Um,
Yes. It
but
was razzle dazzle with this hand while we punch with this hand.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the stunt of Russian forces out of Belarus south into Ukraine was nothing more than an attempt to draw Ukrainian forces to the north, while they lost a lot of ground in the south, right? And we said this years ago. This is not new. But now you could be looking at a situation where Ukrainian forces made virtually no gains in the south, and Russian forces are in a pretty good position to surge north and take a lot of ground. And Ukrainian forces have not had to face that reality in this entire war. The initial
Yes.
surge, the initial invasion by Russia, everybody thought Russia was going to take two-thirds of Ukraine, in a week or two, maybe
Yeah.
outside of Knightsbridge. But everybody thought that was going to happen, right? Ukraine was lost. And so
Yeah.
there's not a lot of morale loss there because you're fighting for your country, you're fighting unknown
Oh,
odds,
yeah.
etc. This is not the same situation
No.
going into 2024.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think it's going to be really fascinating to see what happens. Which I believe we've got a slide coming up where we go into. Oh, I was wrong. We've got one more point left on here. Uh, and this is a really excellent one, and I like this image a lot. One of the biggest issues that they had was their failures to recognize the depth of Russian defenses. And so this image right here, this shows, I believe, I'm trying to remember where this graphic came from. I want to say
Yeah.
was it Washington
Yeah,
Post?
so this is a Washington Post graphic, and every dot on here represents a heavily fortified position. So this isn't a trench network necessarily. This is a
Yes.
bunker. This is think a concrete fortification of some kind, right? This is a
Yeah.
fortification on a level that can withstand an infantry assault, right? So
Which is
every
not something you build up quickly. I mean,
no,
these
it's
are,
not. This is so every dot here represents something that Russia put together over last winter,
yes,
2022 bleeding into 2023, getting ready for Ukraine's counteroffensive. These are bunkers, heavily fortified
yes,
positions. And if you look, Crimea, massively, massively fortified,
significant.
fortified to a
Yeah,
level we haven't seen since World War II.
yes.
But then even north of that, going up towards Ukraine's primary areas of focus, you've got some
Yes.
really heavy fortifications. And to this point, failure to recognize the depths of Russia's defenses, Ukraine kind of
Absolutely.
charged headlong into a lot of these areas.
And you can see it's not labeled on this map, but it pretty much goes all the way up to the Dnieper River and then coming south out of there. But there, and again, these aren't specific lines. You've got to imagine each one of these dots. There's trench networks built between these. There's even more fortifications. There's minefields. There's stuff like that that's not indicated on this map. But you can see there is something of three lines of defense here. And this was one of the big things that towards the end of the Ukrainian offensive, they were very quick to make comments about, well, we've only made it through the first line. There's still two more to go. This might take a little bit longer than we thought. And you can see it here on this map with your final line of defense really being at Crimea. The Ukrainian offensive only made it to the first line of defense. It didn't, in some places, it got close to and almost started to breach the second line, but it never made it past the second line. And when these defenses were initially going up, you had reports from Russian conscripts where they were talking about, especially in Bakhmut, Wagner forces talking about these foolish generals are putting defenses 300 miles to the south of us. How badly do they think we're going to be beaten? How badly do they think this is going to be? And then as they were retreating towards those defenses, they were like, wow, these guys were geniuses. We've still got three more networks like this behind us. We've still got more bunkers back there. We've still got, and that had going back to morale, that had a rousing effect for the Russians as they were like, oh, wow, the generals actually were prepared for this. We were prepared for this. We've got plans. We've got places to go. We're going to bleed these guys dry and we're going to be safe doing it. And that's kind of what you've seen throughout this summer is these Russian defenses. Yes, they were broken in some places. Yes, there were some successes. Yes, there were complete routs of Russian units where they were just decimated as they were retreating. But as a whole, they had these lines, they had these reconsolidation points, and even when they broke, even when they were decimating these entire units, they still eventually hit spot. They held the line, re-exerted itself, and the Ukrainian forces weren't able to push through it. Now, what's kind of fascinating, and it's something I've been watching a lot as this has been going on, the Ukrainian forces haven't been building defenses to the level that the Russians did. So we saw before February, even as the Russian offensive was winding down, they were expending significant resources to build these lines of defenses. Ukraine has been taking ground, taking ground, taking ground, and they've been occupying Russian defenses, but they've not been establishing their own defenses. And I think that's going to be really interesting if they don't change that soon.
Yeah, I'm so happy you brought that point up because I was in discussions with one of our private clients uh, just a couple of days ago, and we were talking about what happens next, right? What
Yeah,
happens when Russia starts its own offensive, which we all think is, late winter, early spring, right?
absolutely.
What happens when that kicks off? Can Ukraine hold back Russia like Russia held back Ukraine? And the
Yeah,
indicators are absolutely not, because Russia built these fortifications while it
yeah,
was still engaged in its own offensive last
yes,
winter, right? They
yes,
had something of the foresight, but I think even more importantly, they had the manpower to build
yes,
these defenses. They could bring in concrete, they
yeah,
could bring in rebar, they could bring in all these resources just in case. And I think that the Russian leadership saw the writing on the wall that, guess what? We're not taking all of Ukraine this winter, right? Which everyone
yeah,
knew they weren't,
yeah,
but they could kind of see that and say, you know what? Ukraine's going to launch a counteroffensive, which they had announced in February. We need to get ready for it. So
yeah,
we were dropping reports in January and February and March, highlighting that Russia is getting ready for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But on the flip side, we're not seeing that same thing out of Ukraine. They're so invested in this offensive against Russia
yeah,
that they're really not paying any attention to defense. And, now that they've expended a lot of resources trying to retake their territory, what's next? Because they don't have the trench systems, they don't have the minefields, they don't have the dragon's teeth, they don't have the
yeah,
bunkers that Russia had. So, setting that all up, and I guess I'm segueing perfectly into the next slide, but setting
yes.
all of that up, Russia's kind of in a great position here when it comes to this war.
Yeah, they really are. And I hate to, and I know anytime you talk pro one side or the other, you say something positive for one side or the other, everyone's like, oh, he's a Russian robot, or he's a, mindless Ukrainian supporter or whatever, depending on who they are.
It
I
comes with the
hesitate.
game. It comes with the game.
Yes, it absolutely does. So I hesitate to praise Russia too highly, but Russia, whether advertently or inadvertently, has set themselves up in a very good position to launch into their winter offensive. And, some of it I feel like was intentional, and some of it was just the good luck that warfare often provides or doesn't provide to people. I do strongly suspect we are going to see significant issues with the Ukrainian forces when Russia launches their offensive. And I'm curious to see the morale aspect of it. I think is going to be huge, because if you've got, and I think one of the issues is, again, we go back to our unrealistic goals and our over propagandization of what was going to occur during this offensive. But you had Ukrainian units. There's no reason to prepare defenses here because we're pushing all the way to the Sea of Azov. We don't need defenses way over here. We're hundreds of miles away from the sea. So
Yes.
now they've stalled out, they've gotten stopped. And if they start getting pushed back and they say, oh, why didn't we have defenses? Why didn't anyone tell us we weren't going to get farther? Why didn't anyone tell us the offensive was over? I think you're going to see a lot of confusion, but then I think you're also going to see, wow, if they lied to us about the offensive, what worse lies are they telling us about the defensive? And that's one of those things where, if it really takes root, you could see it kind of be contagious to the point where we start seeing defenses crumbling, or guys refusing to defend areas and wanting to go back further to where better defenses are prepared. And I think that's going to be very interesting to observe leading into what's coming next.
Yeah, I agree with all of that.
And which brings us to our next slide, looking forward into 2024. So we've kind of covered it pretty intensely, but Russia 100% for sure. They've got an offensive plan. They have been preparing resources, they're preparing manpower. Their artillery barrages decreased by something ridiculous like 70 to 80% over the summer offensive. They were still launching significant artillery barrages, but it was to the point where um, different adjacent units like the oh, I can't, it starts with a V, the Vostok Battalion out of Donetsk, which is essentially a militia, but they're funded, supplied by Russia, but not actually Russian. Their commander, he was like, "Why aren't you giving me any artillery? How can I defend my lines without artillery support?" And Russia was like, "Oh, well, figure it out. You've got trenches and everything else." And the main reason was they have been conserving as much as they can, almost to a degree that has been detrimental on the battlefield during the Ukrainian offensive, where lines were starting to break and they were like, "Hey, we need to expend more munitions," and Russia didn't. And the rationale behind that is, or the suspected rationale behind that is that they are conserving these munitions for their winter offensive. But same thing with personnel. They were not sending guys into counteroffensives unless it looked really favorable for them to win. Um, Manpower, resources, the fact that they took all of their raw recruits that they've been recruiting for the last 6 months and didn't throw them into the front lines after a month of training, which is what they did last winter offensive, really speaks to the level of planning and preparation they are making for something big. And it again makes no sense for them to do all of this and not launch an offensive. Plus, it's Russia. Russia, for as long as Russia has been fighting war, has not missed a winter to launch an offensive. That's what they do. They drink vodka and they do winter offensives. Um,
Yeah, and they just bought 1 million artillery shells from North Korea on
oh,
top of
interesting.
that.
I didn't know about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's it. Timing's kind of suspicious.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, they're not only stockpiling, they're buying
Aggressively
artillery
acquiring
shells from North
more.
Korea. They're clawing back some of their military export to Egypt and Pakistan and India and some of the other countries they've sold to. Right, they're absolutely stockpiling for
Yes,
this next offensive. There's just no doubt that that's happening.
yes, no, and I agree 100%. I think I'd be extremely foolish to not anticipate they're going to have an offensive. And I think Knightsbridge is right on point with their suggestion that it's probably going to happen sometime in the December, early January timeframe, because that's traditionally when it's happened. It's when, the winter freeze is set in the best. It's conditions are best for it. You're not having massive snowfall. You're not having massive thaws. So nature wise, it's a good time frame, and it's just traditionally when they've always done it.
Yep,
Um,
absolutely.
next, oh, go ahead.
Nope, I'm just agreeing with you.
Perfect. So our next point, Ukraine's potential lack of Western support. I think this one's going to be huge, especially if Russia launches this very successful offensive. We are going to be coming off the heels of the failures of the Ukrainian offensive. And then if that is compounded by Ukrainian, or excuse me, by a successful Russian offensive, I think Ukraine's going to lose a lot of Western support. And right now, there's huge controversy over, do we support Israel? Do we support Ukraine? Israel, and this goes back to Westerns, the average Westerner's short attention span. Israel's the hotness right now. That's, man, have you seen the footage coming out there? Have you seen what's going on? And that's what's on people's minds. And they're like, well, Israel's actually a U.S. ally. The the misconceptions I hear all the time about our relationship with Israel is kind of funny to me. But for pretty much since Israel started, they've been an ally of the United States, and people are looking at that and saying, "Hey, we have to help our allies." Ukraine's not part of NATO, and so you see this shift towards that, in addition to what was already significantly waning support for Ukraine. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens. Like I said, especially if we see a highly successful, or what looks like it's going to be a highly successful Russian offensive.
Yeah,
And
I mean that segues perfectly into that last point, right? If
I,
Russia does
yes,
have a pretty successful offensive
yeah,
in early 2024 at some point,
Yeah.
Western powers looking at what's going on in Ukraine, looking at what's going on in the Middle East, which, hey, it could be pretty confined in early
Yes.
2024, or it could absolutely spiral out of control.
Yeah.
And
100%.
so, the Western powers, NATO, the US, the EU, et cetera, looking at the situation and
Yeah.
looking at I would say, a likely successful Russian offensive in the early part of 2024 could really be pushing for some kind of negotiated settlement. And it's not
Absolutely.
going to be anywhere close to what Ukraine has been promising, right? That
No.
every
No.
Russian will be driven out of our territory, including Crimea. But
Yeah.
you could be looking at a situation where Western powers say, hey, look, we've got no more artillery shells to send you, Ukraine. We've
Yeah.
got almost no military aid we feel comfortable parting with. And
Yeah.
you've got to come up with some kind of settlement.
And that's a really interesting point. It's something I always like the worst case, best case scenario conflicts. And I think worst case scenario for Ukraine is they lose Western support. And I mean, Ukraine would have, I don't think they would have been able to stop Russia were it not for Western support early on. It could have very easily
Yes.
have been a 3 month long special military operation had Western support not intervened as heavily as it did. So I think, and I don't think, I would imagine it's pretty much a guarantee that Ukraine knows that's their only lifeline. So if the West says, hey, we're going to cut off aid, I would imagine we would very quickly see some type of settlement. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's necessarily a likely course of action, but I think we could see a significant curtailing of Western aid along with a push for, hey, let's figure out what your best option is. And it's easy for, Zelensky or anybody in the Ukrainian political, uh, upper echelons to play the tough man while they've got support, while they've got all this stuff. But you don't survive politics at that level without being able to have a realistic view of the world and what could and cannot happen. And I think if we see Western support start to get cut, if we see Russian offensive gains on a significant level, the tunes will change. Now, what that ultimately entails and how successful it is, I can't say. But I know Knightsbridge was reporting like 4 or 5 months ago that there was already Western political leaders, mostly in Europe, saying, "Hey, we probably ought to figure something else out. We probably ought to draw back this. We need to start looking at peaceful options." And it was quickly shut down. Ukrainian government was like, that's defeatist thinking. How dare you? You don't know what we've been through. You don't know what we've suffered. There's no way that'll ever happen. You should be removed from your post and stuff like that. And it was nobody. I don't think anybody was removed from their post, but there were apologies issued and things of that nature. But the fact that the idea is being teased publicly means that behind closed doors, it's being discussed heavily. And I think it'll be a
Right.
key indicator that something like this is going to occur if we start seeing more open discussion about
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you've had Hungary, Germany, Turkey, the Netherlands, Poland, just off the top of my head, right?
it. Yes.
Issuing those types of statements. And it's not the prime minister, it's not the president, it's, higher ranking officials that are
Yeah.
kind of throwing their doubts out there a little bit.
Yeah.
And typically they'll speak their piece and then it kind of disappears from the news cycle
Yeah.
approximately 15 minutes later, right? But
Generally speaking.
we scrape it up and we find it, we put it in the report because that's what we
Yeah.
do. But yeah, I think there's a lot of doubts floating around that
Absolutely.
back up your point.
Yes. No, and I 100% completely agree. And I think Western support at this juncture is going to be one of the most critical factors for Ukrainian success or failure, secondary to Ukrainians' manpower issues, which I think are going to become more apparent as 2024 unfolds.
Yeah, agree completely.
And I believe that is it for all of our slides on our slideshow. Did you have any extra questions for me?
Yeah, I mean, I think we put a fine point on a lot of these
Yeah,
bullets. I don't have any further questions. I think that this series of closer looks will be really valuable to our subscribers,
absolutely.
and will accurately diagnose the issues with Ukraine's well-publicized counteroffensive. But I think also really valuable is kind of the look forward to 2024 and what to expect there. I mean, the
Absolutely.
odds are some kind of negotiated settlement it's more probable, right, than anything
Yes.
else at this point. Ukraine's not going to drive Russia out of its territory. Russia's not going to take all of Ukraine. So
Yes.
you're either looking at a 30 years war situation, which I don't think
Yeah.
either side is up for, or some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, politically, maybe that's the end of Zelensky if he agrees to let Russia keep Ukrainian territory. Who knows at this point? But
Yeah.
it's looking like Russia's in a pretty good spot when it comes to early 2024, and it's looking like a negotiated settlement is the most likely scenario
Yes.
at some point next year.
And it wouldn't surprise me if we see what I would kind of predict is we see Russian offensive. If it's successful, we see a huge push for a Ukrainian counteroffensive and either a very lackluster Ukrainian counteroffensive or Ukraine's inability to wage a counteroffensive. And I think when that happens, we'll start to see as it gets closer to winter and the possibility of Russia mounting another offensive, Western leaders saying, hey, if you want to keep what you got, you need to figure something out. I suspect that'll probably be what we'll see, unless something, some black swan event happens or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the West is coming to a realization that it can only supply Ukraine for so long, and that it's
Yeah.
kind of getting to the end of its what I would call comfortable limits, right? We can
Yes.
supply you with so much with so many tanks with okay, we'll toss you some F-16s, we'll give you hundreds of thousands of 155 millimeter artillery shells. We'll give you what we can give you. But I think a lot of the Western powers are looking at their own stockpiles and saying, now, wait a minute, what are we
Yeah.
really willing to draw down for Ukraine?
Yeah.
Ukraine's not necessarily an ally of a lot of these countries. It's not in NATO. It's not in the EU. Yeah, it's great to be able to grind down Russia using foreign blood, right?
Yes.
That's a
Yeah.
net positive for NATO. But at the same time, yeah, we're not going to be able to supply you forever. And
No.
so again, a negotiated settlement, 2024, maybe 2025, who knows?
Yeah.
Is probably the most likely scenario here.
I would agree with that. And I think the only thing that will possibly expedite it is if we see significant world events similar to what we're seeing in Israel occur somewhere else, something that further divides or further draws NATO and Western attention and manpower and resources, or something that scares them to the point where they're like, hey, we actually do need to keep our F-16s. Or, it's something similar to that. I'm using an oversimplification of the situation as an example. But I
Yeah.
think that's something we could very potentially see as well.
Yeah. I mean, if, for example, if China invades Taiwan and South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, the US, Australia say, not on our watch,
Yeah,
all of the calculus changes, right?
100%. Yeah. And that would be
Everything
one of
that
those
we're
black swan events.
Oh yeah. I mean, everything we're projecting changes at that point.
Yes,
So,
100%.
Pakistan and India kick off a limited nuclear exchange. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could happen with these global hotspots. But presuming those don't, again, negotiated settlement looks likely at some point in the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that 100%.
Awesome. Well, hey Josh, as always, we did a three-part series back in August with you on emerging military tactics in Ukraine, and then this multi-part series as well, kind of doing a bit of a post-mortem, if you will, on Ukraine's counteroffensive. As always, we really appreciate your expertise and your insights. You spent a lot of time fighting for the United States overseas, and we appreciate your insights and the time you've taken to do this research and to share it with our subscribers.
Absolutely, Matt. And I always appreciate coming on and the opportunity to share this information and just delve into a subject that I really enjoy speaking on and knowing information about and passing that information along. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Fantastic. Well, hey, we appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.
Absolutely.
Thanks. And with that, we conclude this three-part series on the after action review of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive. We do hope that this three-part series has been informative, that it has given you greater insights and understanding on what happened during that counteroffensive, what went right, what went wrong. And we look forward to moving on to a new series starting next week. As always, we appreciate your subscription very much. We hope that we are informing your worldview in a unique and valuable way, and we will see you next week.